got Shaw today. Awesome.
All right, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Justin Martinez, the Event and Program Coordinator for TAO, and welcome to today's educational session on data governance. We asked you what you wanted to learn more about, and this was at the top of the list. A big thank you to CSG Pro for sponsoring our DASL community. Sponsors like you make our communities and these discussions possible. CSG Pro specializes in software and data analytics consulting and has been building modern, scalable software and data solutions since 1993 that are hell-bent on your success. Please join me in welcoming Greg Petrosian.
Hey, everybody. I just want to say hello and thank you. I'm really excited for this session. As Justin mentioned, we're a consulting firm here in Portland, hell-bent on your success and have working with customers just around strategy and data needs. So, great topic. I'm really excited to see Leanne and Matt's leadership in this and excited to be involved.
Excellent. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Kristy to the team. She's a senior analytics leader with 15 years of experience in tech startups and economic development institutions. She's currently a senior director at Kiva, a nonprofit using innovative credit initiatives to increase access to finance around the world. She's built high-performing revenue-driving data functions covering the full analytics spectrum from data engineering to analytics, BI, and data science. This morning, we're looking forward to hearing her discuss practical examples of the problems caused by ungoverned data systems and how to get started with data governance. Kristy, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me, everyone, and nice to meet everyone here. I think this is a lot of new kind of faces and names. So with that, let me share my screen and jump right in. Can you all see the full screen presentation, or are you still seeing the Chrome browser?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Awesome. Okay, let me just now bear with me for a second while I figure out how to toggle into my notes. Okay, you still good? Can you see the full screen presentation?
In the browser, but we can see the slides.
Okay, maybe I just need to go out of presenter mode. Let me try one more time.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay, you can see the full thing?
Yep,
perfect.
Looks great.
Excellent. So thank you, Leanne, for that great introduction. As she mentioned, I'm here to speak with you all about kind of practical examples and advice for structuring data to enable analysis, and really how do you assess the challenges with your system, what would be a best practice system to build, and how do you build a business case for it. And we'll kind of keep this pretty interactive. I'll be speaking for, say, probably 10, 15 minutes. We'll break for some discussion and then come back together to close out the presentation. So starting with just some context setting, kind of making sure we're all on the same page with the problem statement. Why pursue data governance? So I pulled in some quotes. These are actual quotes from one of the organizations that I've been at, from our data users around the challenges that we were having in using data in an ungoverned data system. So 80% of engineering time is spent assisting with data questions instead of building products or services, driving revenue effectively. Yet analysts are spending 80% of their time digging through the mud and only 20% of their time doing analysis. And business teams have to spend time and money finding issues and building workarounds. So I would imagine that some variants of these quotes sound familiar to many of the folks on this call. So when we step back and think about what are that's the problem we're trying to solve, what are the goals that we're trying to get toward, these goals of strong data governance? And I would really posit three primary goals. If we think about those quotes as a contrast to this, business users should be able to quickly self-serve on simple questions, so not requiring an analyst or an engineer. Analysts should be able to dive into more complex questions, spending no more than about 20% of their time on data discovery and cleaning. And in contrast to what we are looking at, where people are often spending the vast majority of their time on data discovery and cleaning. And all analysis should be accurate, at least within some margin of error, and consistent. Those would be kind of our expectations to say, these are the base conditions that we need to really be a data-driven organization and to reliably use data to inform our decisions. So with that framing, I wanted to step back and take a look at what are the typical problems that you're facing if you're looking at bringing in improved data governance. What are the problems that we might be solving? And I would say the overarching problem is data and processes aren't structured to generate business insights. And there's kind of three stages of data systems that might lead to a need for data governance. And I'll go through these at a high level and then walk through examples of each. So stage one, all data is not accessible to all users. Stage two, the data is accessible, but is not really structured for business analysis. It doesn't provide that consistent, easy to use view. Or stage three, the data is well structured, it's easy to use, but there's a lack of ownership or related, a lack of quality assurance across the system that prevents maintenance of those data governance achievements. So I've been in many companies there where they've invested a lot in data governance. You've gotten to that point where it's working. And then years go by, no one actually owns the system, and you're suddenly back in a place where you need to start all over. So going through what do these look like? What do I mean by this? So all data is not accessible for all users. This is often the case, I think, in a variety of companies where data is being generated by teams, systems, different sources across the company, and it stops there. You have these sort of disparate data sets, disparate data systems, and they're not joined together in a data warehouse or otherwise accessible by a single tool. So very hard for anyone to kind of consistently and holistically understand the data and draw out insights. This often results in data just being entirely left out of analysis, used inconsistently, and a variety of other challenges. Second, data is accessible, but not structured for analysis. So what might this look like? So you have still on the left your data that's being generated by a variety of systems or teams, but you actually have that data being joined together in a data warehouse or single tool. And I illustrated here, there might be one pipeline, but often there's a main one, a couple old ones that you're hoping to retire, but they're not quite retired yet. And then that is all being joined into a data warehouse or other single tool. But in that data warehouse, it's not actually structured for analysis. So it's just a dump of raw data or has many ungoverned and transformed tables. And to just illustrate what that might look like, coming from an example from a past company that I was at this past company, our raw data was far too complex to be used in any accurate and repeatable way. So this is like the series of joins you would have to do to get a full view of users' transactions. So clearly not repeatable, scalable for everyone to go through and do all of these joins in every query. So the company, by the time I got there, had developed transformed data tables, but those were actually, I would say, even worse because they seemed usable. You have this nice table, it has this nice documentation, but it was actually under the hood, inconsistent and not well documented. So I have this example here of you have this field is primary account in a daily table, in a monthly table. Those should be able to net up to each other in some way, one would think if you're looking at this documentation. But when you start looking under the hood, and really only when you start looking under the hood, you find that they don't net out at all. They're not equal. And this is kind of the web of SQL that we would have to walk through to understand why. And fundamentally, this was actually an example that I did to try to understand why these were different. And I got to one set of SQL on the left, middle one on the right, and finally this middle one in the middle, finally this one on the right, and pulling from a table that I couldn't even find documentation of. So really no way to understand why would these two fields be different. So in some sense, even more frustrating than just starting with that raw data, which at least was kind of clear how you join it and what's going on. So again, that would be, I would say, the second stage. You can have all your data in one place, but it's not nearly as useful as it looks. And then step three, I would say, is you actually have your data in a good place. You have your raw data, you have your clean curated data. It's working, it's documented. but the feedback loop and the kind of QA across the pipeline is missing. There isn't someone who sort of holistically owns, hey, we have this single data system, we all need to be using it, we need to maintain it, who's a stakeholder of that, who can uphold that QA is happening along the way. As new data is generated, a stakeholder can say, yep, it's being fed into the data warehouse, it fits our system. As we're curating new data, we can say, yep, we're not generating any inconsistencies. So I think often there's a set of companies that kind of get to this place, but they don't have that stakeholder that can make sure, or kind of the strong QA system that can make sure that it's actually maintained. So those are, I would say, stepping back, the three states that most companies find themselves in when they're starting to say, okay, we really need some data governance. So compared to those kind of challenging systems, what would we be aiming for as we're trying to build our sort of best practice, and we're trying to bring in data governance and really build these best practices? So again, starting with, we have our data that's being generated by a variety of systems or teams. This could be CSVs, this could be kind of SQL databases. It's ideally going through one single pipeline into a cleaned data warehouse where you have your raw data, you have ETL that's generating a curated data layer, a reporting data layer, and sandboxes. And this is really like truly best practice. We can talk a bit at the end around how do you, if you can't do all of this, how do you prioritize? But you have your raw data that's kind of cleaned into that curated usable form. A lot of the joins are pre-done. The kind of dirty data is cleaned up and made consistent. Reporting layer on top of that is sort of for your business user that abstracts even further and is, here's the 20 most common fields. And then sandboxes for your analysts and really technical users to play around and to generate and save even their own data. But in a way that is safe from other people, that doesn't kind of muddy your curated data or your reporting data layer. I have the slide which kind of basically describes what I just went through. So this is what that might look like if you kind of step back and look across that data warehouse, this best practice. So stepping back to our kind of high level diagram. And then we have our happy users here at the end who are safely querying all but the raw data. So ideally no one is touching the raw data. Maybe you have highly technical, very specific use cases for that. But ideally you've built a data warehouse where everyone can be querying from the curated data, the reporting layer, or their sandboxes. And then you have your BI tool kind of sitting on top of that as well. Everything drawing from the same place. And then finally, the last thing layered on top of it is you have this change management process. So you have someone, probably your analytics team or a stakeholder for them, a kind of speaker for them, that can own the whole system and say, we have a vested interest in maintaining this system. And so we're going to work with the folks that are inputting the data back at the very left side of our diagram, and care that across the entire system, we're checking the integrity of data as new data is being produced. This team is there to say, hey, we're going to raise our hand and say, this needs to make it into the data warehouse. It needs to fit into this schema. We need to use this naming convention so that we don't use the same name to mean different things. And then you have your integrity and failure checks across the pipeline. So integrity checks on the data that's being generated, failure notifications on your pipeline itself, and then test and failure notifications in your ETL. That's often the most critical spot because it can be hard as data is coming in to really truly QA it. But in your ETL, you can say, hey, we're expecting, if we have this number of users, we're expecting this number of users to appear here and here. Does our clean data actually match up and net out? So I think automated tests that tell us when something has broken down the line that our data is unusable, so that we don't have to go try to use it only later to discover that our numbers were wrong. So this is kind of the high level overview of, if we're going to embark on data governance, what are we trying to get to? What's that best practice? So at this point, I mentioned we're hoping to do a bit of an interactive presentation. So we wanted to break at this point into, we're gonna, I think, sign you up for breakout rooms and chat a bit about, okay, this is all well and good. We have these problems. Yes, like we all agree. I saw some people nodding, some people laughing, like, yeah, this sounds about right. And yes, this diagram makes sense. This is what we're trying to get to. It's beautiful. Great, sign me up. But all of that is kind of the easy part. And often the hard part is, how do you that this is needed? How do you get everyone to go along with it? How do you actually like kick it off and build the thing? So we wanted to, so that's what we'll address in the second part of this presentation. But first, we wanted to kind of pause, give you all a chance to chat and talk through, does this resound? Does this feel familiar to the problems you have? And then as we bring you back together, we'll be asking you to think of what do you see as the primary challenges in sort of advocating for this and building the business case? So that's probably the best main topic for discussion, is just, do you agree with these problems? Do you have them too? And then what kind of prevents you from being able to build these solutions and build that business case in your organization? So Justin, do you want to do your breakout room magic?
Great, we'll be throwing you into breakout rooms. You'll just need to click the join button that'll pop up on your screen.
Organization, because particularly with data systems, it's always going to be more efficient and have a higher ROI for the company if you're building something that can be used for everyone, as opposed to, it can be a little bit easier, faster to build something that just works for you and your team, but the ROI is typically substantially less, and that's when you start running into those issues of inconsistency, different numbers coming from different departments. So in the diagnosis, the goal can really be to build something like the systems diagram that I showed initially, of the kind of where might the problem be. So we have our data, we have our pipeline, we have our data warehouse. Here's what it looks like. So actually building that diagram, I started with whiteboarding, for example, and just drew out, what do I think all the pieces are, and what are the ones that are working and what are they not. So really comparing to that best practice and saying, here's where we look different. And so starting with the actual analysts, like the people that are using the system day in and day out and suffering from the challenges, they're going to be the ones that say like, hey, here's my view of the problem. And as you go around and talk to the different departments, you will almost certainly hear a lot of the same themes, but you'll hear other pieces as well. Like, oh, there's this data set over here that no one even knows about. Or there's this old pipeline here that we really need to retire, but we haven't yet. And the lack of QA there is causing all these issues. So you kind of, as you talk to the different analysts, you're building up the different pieces of your diagram and kind of iterating on it. You probably have the right base to begin with, but there's all these little details that matter, both for to get the right solution and also to make sure everyone feels heard as you get to the next steps of the process, that they see their problem in the diagram. And so second is kind of an iteration on that, which is department by department, I would say, honestly, whiteboarding with both the working level analysts that you talked to initially, but also the head of the department, to say, hey, here's what I see across the organization. And I would literally be in a conference room, like whiteboarding out, drawing the diagram that I showed you all and speaking to it as I drew it, and then drawing like, hey, here's what a best practice data system would look like. And you can visually see, like, one is at the top of the whiteboard, one's at the bottom. You can visually see those differences and see where the gaps are. And for the kind of head of department, this is often like very new to them. They aren't in the weeds working with the data, but they can really visually see that difference. And their analyst who works for them is there nodding and saying like, yep, that is my problem. That is what's stopping me from getting my work done. And I see like my specific problem is in there. And you might iterate on your diagram even a little bit more here as you see people react to it. And as you hear someone say like, I don't know if I quite understand that, or I don't know if I quite buy into that. You can, just like erase it as you go, change it, take a picture, and then you go to the next, you kind of do a circuit through all the different departments and whiteboarding. And so that I would say kind of achieves this dual goal of both, how do you make sure you're building something that works for everyone? And how do you actually build up this kind of working level and then gradually department level buy-in to like, yes, this is what we need. This will solve our problems. And your goal is really to come out of those meetings with analysts saying like, yes, oh, if you built this would be just so exciting. And that's when you've gotten the right, you've hit on the right solution, and you're kind of on your way to building that to building the ground level advocacy that you need to ultimately set aside resources. So then you actually build the business case. And I'll walk through a little bit what this looks like, but I would say the 3 steps to that: prioritizing and building a roadmap to determine the proposed solution. That the kind of best practice system, it's pretty detailed. There's a lot going on, right? Four different segments of your data warehouse, for example, would all have to be built. You aren't going to do all of it at once. You might not even do all of it ever. So what are the pieces that matter most for you, and what's your roadmap for getting there? And then determining the costs and benefits. What will you gain from having this? And what resources, existing or new, do you need to achieve that? And then presenting your business case, ideally to a cross-functional lead or team that touches many of the affected departments, so that they kind of have the control over the budget to say, yes, I see this need across the business, and I can set aside budget for it. It's often not something that one department alone can kind of budget or take on. So what does it look like to build this business case? So this is an example of a proposed roadmap that is somewhat specific to the tech company environment, but generalizes as well, I would say. So in my case, when I've done this, the proposed roadmap has been, first we need to hire a team that's going to build and maintain those parts of the data warehouse. Or for folks who are dealing with that unstructured data that needs to go into a data warehouse, it is, hey, we need someone whose job it is to structure the data, to get it all in one place, to build these pipelines. This is often a multi-year, highly technical job, and it's not something that can be done by one person with 10% of their time. They can feel like trivial problems to people who don't work with data, but as I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you, they are highly non-trivial problems. So that's my kind of part one. We need to hire. This is step one. We need to get the people in the room and get their time allocated to actually do this work. This needs to be their priority. Step two, the team needs to be a stakeholder with the people that are producing the data, or the data pipeline owners. So that often the IT team and engineering team, they need to work with data producers to build raw data documentation so that they can actually do this work. So this is what's going to be needed to make this team successful. To actually facilitate their curation of the data. They can't do that if they don't have documentation of the raw data. They need to establish that change management and data integrity process. And they might identify that they need things from the data producers or the data engineers, the pipeline owners, that need to be on those folks' roadmap. And then step three is we established an existing, in our case, the existing analytics team, really the kind of data users who were the most technical, the people that were doing the complex data problems and often working with the business users as the data user stakeholder. And we threw in this piece that said, we're not only going to have them be the stakeholder for this system, but we're also going to have them be the owner of our BI tool, which spoke a lot to our business users, because they're not dealing with that whole system. They're not actually writing SQL queries against the data warehouse, but they are often pulling data from a BI tool, and that BI tool is often messy. It's often equally ungoverned. There's often many reports that have just slightly different views of the underlying data. So we can throw in, hey, we need our analytics team to be the data user stakeholder, and we will also have them maintain shared company dashboards and maintain the BI tool to sort of govern that and say, hey, we can't have two different reports that look ever so slightly different, but use the same terms. So this was our roadmap to how do we get this best practice system built. So next, estimate the benefits to the organization, the ROI. This is a really hard one because it's often pretty intangible. We're not going to go build something that is directly revenue driving, right? Unless you're selling your data itself, then your data is not itself driving revenue. But the way that I've seen it happen, you can do it a number of different ways. But one is that the company has it has hired people to work with the data, right? And to produce the data. That is alone an investment. So for example, we have right now, the people that you hired to generate insights are instead spending their time maintaining and working around this horrible data system. So, that takes 20% of data science time, 50% of data analyst time, 30% of data engineering time is all just going into this hole of working with messy data. And what do those salaries add up to? So in this case, 670K per year in annual payroll. And hey, there's a reason you hired these employees, and it was not to, just spend their day messing around in unstructured data and getting nothing out of it. They were hired to spend this time producing added value for the business. The analysts are there to inform business decisions and make them better. The data scientists are there to add value to our products, or build new customer-facing products. The engineers are there to support our product, not just to build data structures. And so, assume when you hire someone, you're expecting them to generate, say, 2 to 3x their annual payroll and value. So what's that value that we're effectively missing by sending all of this time into just messing with messy data rather than actually doing what the business wants? So this is how I have approached estimating the benefits. In many cases, it's really about putting a dollar figure on there rather than like deeply justifying it. Other approaches I've seen, this was one that we talked about in the breakout room I was at that I really appreciated, is sort of taking a pilot project that is done being done in the unstructured data environment, kind of a proof of concept, and help people understand, hey, here's one project, we can do 20 more of these, and at half the time, if we have better governed data, and here's the value we got out of just this one. So that is the other approach. In this case, we went with the payroll approach because we were talking less about kind of huge organizational shifting projects and more just the day-to-day, hey, we're making bad decisions because we don't understand how many customers we have and how many transactions they're making. And so then once you've kind of showed people, here's the money we're losing by not having this, then you jump into, okay, what will it cost us to fix it? And ideally, you are putting together a business case that shows that much lower cost than the value you've estimated. So in this case, it draws out what's the team we need. And it might be a new team, or it could be existing folks. Either way, it's the same kind of, it's either an opportunity cost or an incremental cost for the organization. So you can kind of think of it in the same way. So who are the resources that we need? Really called out, here's the additional ones, here's the skill sets that we don't have now. Here's the people this needs to be their full-time job. But we can also use all these other existing resources to achieve pieces of this. So, and we called it the other resource needs because we didn't need to make a case for hiring these resources, but we needed to make the case for prioritizing their time on it. I saw time called out in the word cloud. And I think that's often one of the biggest barriers is, especially if you're not going to hire new people, you need to be able to make the case that, hey, we're going to work on this instead of something else. Otherwise, this is never the thing that gets worked on. And so we really cleared out, hey, you're going to need to set aside this amount of your analyst time to actually build these things. Like this is what we're going to need from the existing departments. We had a few options. If we hire a 3-person team, here's how long it would take us to kind of hit our initial milestone. If we have a 4-person team, here's how much faster we can do it. In my case, we ended up going with the 3-person team, which was fine. And then here's the incremental cost, which again is ideally much lower than the added value you've shown. And then you really meet with your cross-functional department head, and you lay out the case. And this is actually a version of the deck that I have used in the past to make the case for building a better governed data system. So actually showing people essentially that I've done my homework. Here's our system. Here's all the problems with it in as much detail as they want. The original version of this slide deck was like 100 slides, and I kind of animated walking through each piece of the data warehouse with kind of giant red stars to show like, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. Here's what the best practice one looks like, here's the gaps. And then walking through this, here's what we get out of building this, here's how long it'll take us, here's how much we need. And you kind of start with the same framing slides that we started with today of why do we even care about this? Like, what are our tenets? What are people saying that makes us know that we need this? And then, as I said, meeting with that really a cross-functional department head, someone who touches many of the departments that this will impact, because it is often quite hard to justify this from one department's budget alone. So with that, I will close, and I think, Justin, were you going to facilitate a Q&A for us? And I'll stop sharing my own screen.
Yeah, so we're gonna still do Q&A through Mentimeter, but feel free to pop things into the chat as well if you like. So you'll go back to the same application we were using just a moment ago. It's the same code. You can scan the QR code or go to menti.com. The code is 6512554. And I will populate the questions as they come in. So our first question, where does self-service BI fit into a well-governed data system?
Yes, that is such a good question. So I would say self-service BI, actually, if I can pull up my screen again, I will share, go back to that part of the presentation. Let's see. Are you all able to see the slide deck again?
Yeah.
So that part, it's kind of just hidden over here. So it's this little section, this is BI tool here. And really what I've found is that self-service BI is, it sits on this foundation, that once you have your curated data layer, and particularly the reporting data layer can help a lot with this. One of the hallmarks of knowing that you have built the right curated data system and the right reporting layer is that people can then self-serve from the BI tool. So if I go back to what the data warehouse might look like, your curated data, you might have your table that's transactions, accounts, customers. And these should be kind of business friendly terms, right? People know what a customer is. They've all agreed. They know what accounts are. The documentation is easy to find so that they can then go into the BI tool and say, the transaction table, here's where I might sum all of our deposits or all of our revenue. So it's really I would say this is all the underpinning of self-service BI. And if you do this right, you can put your BI tool on top of it, and generally let self-service go from there. I think the other component is that self-service often turns out much better if you do have that, often an analytics team that kind of takes ownership of self-service and says, hey, we're going to train people as they come in, both on maybe on our BI tool, but definitely on our data. So I've worked with actually we had Chart.io at my last company. I worked with our Chart.io reps to have them lead a training for new users, but they would co-lead it with us and we would use our data as an example. And then we would actually, the analytics team would offer to code review people's dashboards. And we put this giant green check mark at the beginning of each dashboard name if we had code reviewed it and said, yep, this is up to our standards. The terminology is correct. The data behind it is correct. And so we did put that additional layer of facilitation on it. And that's less around kind of data governance, I would say, and more just around kind of BI tool governance.
Great. Our next question is, data governance speaks to stewardship as well. Were you able to incorporate stewards into your organization?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. We had the team that we hired to build our curated data system. We also gave them the responsibility of ensuring that they understood kind of, for example, the privacy concerns, data security access, who can access what things, what's considered PII, and that they weren't exposing, they kind of owned where are we exposing different types of data. And so we would only expose certain types of data to our BI tool, for example. And then we limited access to the data that was in the data warehouse to people who had the right level of security. So that team, we did give them ownership because they kind of had the holistic view of the data warehouse. And they were the ones who owned what could be exposed where.
Awesome. Next question, change management when upgrading systems. What should we focus on?
That is a big question. I think I'm trying to think how to best answer that. I would say the biggest piece is that you have your stakeholder, whether it's the team that owns your data warehouse or your analysts or possibly both, that are talking to the people who are upgrading the systems and effectively giving a set of requirements and saying, hey, this is the form that we need the data to come in. So here's what our pipelines are expecting. Here's what our curated tables are expecting. Ideally, when you're upgrading systems, the data is going to kind of fit naturally into your curated data where you're looking, for example, you're switching call vendors and you're still looking at calls from a business concept, and it's just a different data source. And so you can kind of keep your curated data tables looking the same. You still have your table of calls with all the same information. And what you change is the ETL code that's creating that curated table to point to a different place and probably use the data differently to generate that calls data. So that's often the biggest thing, is focusing on how do you probably care about the same business concepts. How do you kind of map them over? Often there's a question of how do you ensure historical continuity. So how do you have a calls data table that both has your historical calls record and your new one? And that's typically the responsibility of the team that owns the data warehouse. It's part of why you want that team that kind of owns having the data warehouse and curating the data, is that they can take ownership of, okay, here's the type of data we're looking for. Here's how we're going to structure it to still make that same business concept available to our end users. And ideally, your end users aren't totally aware of the changeover, right? They're just still using calls.
Awesome. Next question. What have you found to be the most effective way to talk about data governance with executives who don't fully understand analytics?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think there's two pieces. One is from the systems perspective. I think that the showing your work of actually walking them through, like, here's what our data is, like piece by piece. Here's how far it is from best practice. Really, like, visualizing that can be helpful. Both to they don't fully understand it at all, really, but they can kind of look at it and say, oh yeah, there's a lot of red stars over that. Like, there's a lot of kind of red explosions over that diagram. This is bad. And you've just if you can clearly convey that you know what you're talking about, and that you've really in detail done this diagnosis. Ideally, this is why you often want the executives in the room along with their analysts. If they're analysts who they trust can vouch for you. Yep, this is exactly the problem that I've been trying to tell you about. You see it in the diagram. So I think that's one piece of it. Another piece is really, I think that's where a specific use case can be really helpful. Of like, here's the revenue that we drove, or here's the cost that we saved with this project. And now imagine that we do 20 of those or 100 of those, and we do them this much faster. So really putting it in terms, ultimately in business terms that they can understand.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Looking at the time estimates to build the curated layer, 4 to 7 months for a 4-person team. I know this is an estimate, but could you speak to how many data sources you were thinking with?
That is a great question. So in this case, we had, I think we had a simpler problem to solve than some other companies face, because this was at a software company where we were generating all of the data ourselves from our own backend systems. And so all of the data was already in the data warehouse. We had the raw data there. And it was really just a question of the team coming up to speed on that raw data and then writing the SQL code to transform it, so to build a customers table or to build a transactions table. So the diagram that I showed initially of all those tables with the joins, that was all in our data warehouse already. And so our data team just had to understand those joins, understand how to put them together to kind of build our core tables. We were working with probably, I would say, like 10 or 15 different backend data sources, but I think it takes a lot longer if you are if you're starting at the place of unstructured data and getting that all together into the data warehouse. That definitely can add some amount of time. There's tools out there that can simplify that a lot, but that does add some time to it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristy. We really appreciate you taking the time to present to the community and share your insights. If we didn't get to your questions today, I will follow up by posting them in our Mobilize community and share the answers to some of the questions submitted in our follow-up email as well. Again, thank you to CSG Pro for sponsoring our community, and a big thank you to Matt and Leanne for putting this together and being your community co-chairs. We really appreciate your work and support. That'll conclude today's educational session. Be on the lookout for our next events. that will likely be beginning in January. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or questions, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
And thanks to you all for having me.
Thanks, Kristy.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.